Sampson. Will your remark?
Good afternoon, Madam President. I want to just start by concurring with my good colleague, Senator Fazio, and his remarks. I think that he stated the case very eloquently, but I want to just step back a second and create some framework around this discussion. And that is that while everyone seems to be being pulled towards national politics and outrage, what is happening here in this chamber right now is so very important to the people of Connecticut, it cannot be overlooked. I've been approached by 3 or 4 members of the press today, and each one of them started the conversation with what's going on in national politics with President Trump or with ICE or Minneapolis. They should be focused on what is happening in this room right now, because all of that is political theater that is being used as a distraction to allow the majority party, and in fact, one man, the governor of this great state, to have the power to spend $330 million taxpayer dollars with virtually no oversight. That is a shame. In all of my years in the legislature, I have seen very few cases where the bold policy impact of a short bill like this, which may be the only redeeming factor it has is that it's not 1,000 pages long, is so clear-cut and so offensive to the senses. I hope that the people of Connecticut are aware of what's happening here. I hope that they get the opportunity to really weigh this in their minds, if this is the type of government that we want to have, where we have a state leader who takes to the podium in the House of Representatives to deliver a budget address that starts by creating national division and rhetoric. How about we focus on what is actually happening in Connecticut? As Senator Fazio mentioned, we are back here again, effectively replaying the same scenario that happened in November when we were here in special session to, at that time, create another slush fund. How about we focus on what is actually happening in Connecticut? As Senator Fazio mentioned, we are back here again, effectively replaying the same scenario that happened in November when we were here in special session to, at that time, create another slush fund. That time, $500 million, effectively given to the governor with very little oversight, no legislative oversight, no public hearings for how the money would be delivered, no audits after the fact, just a blank check. And now we're back because apparently he couldn't figure out how to spend $500 million in only a couple of months. He only ended up spending around $187 million of it. So here we are today, back to get the other $330 million or so in a new bill with a new timeline. And instead of like the first bill, which expired after only a couple of months and was created out of some emergency that was established by the majority's opinion, not fact, this one has almost no end in sight. It goes on for over a year. When we came in November, there was a government shutdown that was underway. And the House, I don't remember what days of the week it was. I think the House was in on a Wednesday and we were in on a Thursday, something like that. We were in the day after. Remarkably, the House voted for that package on the Wednesday when the shutdown was still happening, but then the shutdown ended that night. They wrapped it up. The Democrats and Republicans in Washington managed to come to terms and they actually ended the shutdown. You would think, if you had common sense, that would be the end of this conversation. Oh, I guess we don't need it anymore. That's not what happened. What happened is the Senate Democrats brought us in anyway, even after the shutdown was over, to vote to give the governor $500 million as a blank check, as a credit card on the backs of Connecticut taxpayers. And as I said, that emergency waned before we ever voted in the Senate. And there's certainly no emergency now. There's no national government shutdown. There's no federal crisis occurring. What is happening are some routine adjustments to how the federal government spends benefits and delivers money to taxpayers across this country for various programs. At most, this is simply rolling back some pre-COVID level amount of funding for different programs. The bill contains no definition of emergency. There is no trigger that says the emergency is actually in effect, we need to spend the money. Nothing. It is just, it starts today, effective 2/4/26. Emergency, no emergency, it doesn't matter. What's happening here is that we are witnessing not emergency government, we're witnessing convenience government. We are here because it's more convenient for the majority to come here with an emergency certified bill and grant themselves all kinds of power with taxpayer dollars rather than having to go through the legislative process. The legislative process would include committee meetings, public hearings, comment from the people of this Connecticut whose money we are spending. Nah. Apparently the majority doesn't think any of that's actually necessary. It's much more convenient to slap the emergency label on this bill and bring it in here and jam it down our throats in a couple of hours while simultaneously trying to distract everyone with national politics. The people of Connecticut need to pay attention. The press that is covering the news today needs to focus on this. This is not Minneapolis. This is whether or not the people that we live in our communities with, our neighbors, our relatives, our parents, our grandparents, whether or not they can afford to pay their bills. Because Connecticut, frankly, despite listening to the governor's speech about how everything is so rosy, it's not rosy. I have constituents that contact me virtually every day who have to make hard decisions about whether they're going to pay their electric bill or whether they're going to fix their gutters on their house or whether or not their furnace is going to work. It shouldn't be like that. It should not be like that. Federal responsibility, in this particular case, is being shifted to Connecticut residents. Connecticut taxpayers, frankly, already pay federal taxes for federal programs. And what's happening here is Connecticut taxpayers are going to be asked to be taxed again for the same thing because the federal government didn't deliver those benefits, so now, supposedly, it's now the state's responsibility. But we're going to actually charge the people of Connecticut twice for the same thing? Does that sound like good fiscal policy? I don't think so. This bill takes the power away not of just the lawmakers. There's 187 state lawmakers, 36 senators, 151 state representatives. We rightfully should get to vote on every policy that affects the residents of this state. That's why we have elections, folks. That's why we have representative government, which, in fact, in my view, is the thing that defines our country, representative government. That is all out the window. The majority, despite the fact that they're in the majority, by the way, and they can win every vote, but they still feel the need to go around the process. You know why? Because the process would be unbelievably embarrassing for them. If they had to actually go to hearings and listen to more than just a half an hour of me speaking on the floor exposing this, if there were a lot of people covering it, if there were a lot of people learning about it, if there were a lot of people talking about it, I think that there would be a lot more outrage. And sure, I'm raising my voice. I am trying to make up for the fact that there was not enough outrage because there was not enough public presence of this policy. Because frankly, the majority did not have the decency to allow this policy to go before the people. When this money is spent, and in fact, let's just jump right to it. I got the bill here. If you look at Section 4, which I refer to as the No Kings section of the bill, this is the part that effectively says that OPM, which is the Office of Policy and Management, which is synonymous with the governor, I like to consider it as OPM, other people's money, they're going to be in charge of this $330 million, carte blanche. And the only way that a decision that the governor makes about how to spend the $330 million, the only way it can be stopped is if a majority of the leadership of this legislature, and let me just break that down for you, it's 6 people. You have the president of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, both Democrats, and then of course you have the leaders of the House and Senate Democrats, so that makes 4 Democrats. And then you have the minority leaders, the House and Senate minority leaders, which are Republicans. So it's a 4-2 vote. Now, normally when we have to vote on something in this chamber, we have to actually win the vote. It's got to be more than 50-50. Not this. Tie doesn't go to a runner here. You actually have to vote against the governor being able to spend this money, which it means requires a 4-2 vote against. How is that going to happen exactly? And the answer is it's not. And they know that. And every one of us, by the way, and I'm talking to my Democratic colleagues right now, that your leadership would sign up for a bill that basically negates your role in any of this. Because you have no say. You're going to vote for this bill and give up your rights. And worse than that, Madam President, worse than that, you're going to give up the rights of your constituents to decide. It's not okay. The people that elect us, they have a right to be represented. They also have a right to know whether or not you agree with how the money is spent. This is shirking your duty if you vote yes, in my view. You're basically saying, I'm going to step back, I don't care, I'm going to just trust that Governor Lamont is going to do whatever he thinks is best. After the speech I just listened to, I don't trust that man, frankly. His speech was filled with politics and derision and division, the exact same things that the people on the street are saying they don't want. They want to see us focused on policy, making the state more affordable, improving the lives of Connecticut residents for the future. That's what I want. That's why I'm standing here. This is an unbelievably dangerous precedent, on top of 1,000 other dangerous precedents that are already happening, like the notion of emergency certification for bills. When you start to have this level of convenience, that there's actually no real emergency going on, there's nothing you can point to that's happening today that wasn't happening yesterday, etc. And you could just say, oh, it's an emergency, it's an emergency. So therefore, we can just skip the whole legislative process and we can grant one man extraordinary power. It's absurd. If everything is an emergency, where's the accountability? What happens when we have a real emergency? This bill deletes 187 lawmakers from the process. Frankly, that's what it does. Let me just talk a little bit about the money itself. Why does the state have an extra $330 million or $500 million or whatever number is kicked around on a day-to-day basis? Why is that money sitting in our state government coffers? I'll tell you why. Over-taxation. It's there because the majority party has passed policies in the state to take too much tax money from the citizens. Now, in my view, when I know that there's people back home in my district that are having trouble paying their bills or buying their medication or keeping up with their public benefits charge on their electric rates, I would say give them back their money. It's theirs. I'm afraid that there are people in this room and in this building who forget whose money they're talking about. They think it's the state's money. It's the state's money, Senator. No, it's not. It's money that was earned through the hard work of individual citizens in this state who actually had to do something to get their paycheck. It's not the state's money. The state doesn't have a right to use it any which way they choose. The state is obligated to have policy passed through a legislative process that is approved by the people who are elected by the actual citizens. Not one man, not a king, a dictator, authoritarian, or even a governor granted ridiculous power. This bill is so broadly written, it shocks the senses. When we were here in November, I remarked about how the last bill wasn't about specific cuts. It's not like, oh, the federal government is going to cut this one little section of SNAP, we should make up for it. It wasn't even that. I could maybe even get around that. In fact, if we had a conversation about that, we could probably pass that in a bipartisan way. But that's not what happened. They just globally said, well, healthcare. Opening the door to have that money spent on all kinds of things that had nothing to do with what the federal government was doing as far as cuts. But you know something? That was not broad enough, apparently, for this majority. That was not broad enough, because what they've done now is they've come back and they said, we're going to use these terms, policy impacts. What is a policy impact? That is not a definitive policy decision. That is not a cut that you can identify. That's just a random broad term that opens the door for whatever you want. Referring once again to the bill, it says, for the purpose of responding to the policy impacts and mitigating any action or inaction. So if the federal government does something or doesn't do something, guess what? The governor can spend money. It's insulting, frankly, to write a bill like that. You should just write one page. The governor shall now be king. Just do that. One sentence. Trying to couch that in some ridiculous language is absurd. And I'm offended by it. And any thinking person who actually understands what's going on here would be offended by it too. And I will repeat that my Democratic colleagues who are going to sacrifice their own vote on what happens with this money in the future ought to be just as offended. We're effectively outsourcing our constitutional powers to OPM. Not to mention the fact that the last year and a half has been a series of news stories about corruption, where we're finding out that money that was earmarked to various NGOs is suspect, to say the least, in how it's being used. We learned actually last year that we earmark money to various organizations without even a contract in place to begin with, without even an understanding of what the money will be used for. That's actually drafted after. So a Democratic lawmaker can go to their leadership and say, well, you know what? I'm in a tough district. I could really use some money for some specific program that might help me out with my voters. And I'm using that as an example because that is exactly what the Speaker of the House said to the press when he was asked about it. But the fact is that some of that money goes to organizations that we could not identify. We could not find them. We looked online. We looked with the Secretary of State. These are not registered businesses. And it's only after the fact the Judicial Department is tasked with the job of locating who the recipient is and then drafting some, frankly, half-ass one-page document about what the money is for. Again, no way to run a state government. No way to be responsible with the people you represent's money that they worked for. So I'm concerned. I'm concerned that this money, that the governor is going to have this authority to be able to hand out willy-nilly, and for whatever reason he deems is appropriate, much like the majority can deem any emergency anytime they want, I'm worried that that money's actually going to go to something of value. How do we know? How do we know? I could ask the good chairman of the Appropriations Committee a bunch of questions about this, but I don't need to. I already know the answers. Is there an audit process, madam? Nope, there's not. There's no audit. There's no nothing. Carte blanche, blank check, money goes, end of story. We're lucky if we get a report after that says one sentence about where millions of dollars go. It's unbelievable. What should happen instead is that if there are federal changes going on that truly affect the people of Connecticut, in some way that we need to address it, then we should. But that would mean identifying the specific programs, identifying the real dollar losses, holding public hearings, allowing the minority to participate in the process of drafting the legislation, and requiring the full legislature to actually vote on the substance. Before $1 gets spent in this state of the state's money, again, the taxpayers' money, the public deserves transparency and debate. With that, Madam President, I want to offer an amendment.
Mr. Clerk, and you'll let us know what it is, and then Mr. Clerk will announce it.
Thank you very much, Madam President. The clerk is in possession of LCO number 675. I ask that this amendment be called, and I be given leave of the chamber to summarize.
Mr. Clerk.
LCO number 675, Senate Amendment A.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Back in November, I offered a similar amendment, which was, since the state seems to be in possession of hundreds of millions of excess dollars taxed from the state of Connecticut's residents, and it does not have a purpose and is therefore just sitting there as overtaxation, in my view, the best solution is to return it back to those people. So I had offered an amendment back in November to return the $500 million back to taxpayers of the state of Connecticut in the form of checks. Just tax refunds. Your money, you can have it back. Sorry we took it from you. We didn't need it. Unfortunately, that amendment failed, 24-11, on party lines. I'm going to try again today, Madam President. So I have this amendment that is before us, which is a very similar amendment that refers to the new dollar amount, which today is $330 million. But this amendment, very simply, would, instead of doing all of this crazy nonsense that shows up in the bill that is before us, empowering the governor to spend $330 million any which way he chooses with no legislative oversight whatsoever, this amendment would say that the DRS, the Department of Revenue Services, would simply return this money back to the taxpayers. It works out to maybe somewhere around $300 or $400 per person. I move adoption, Madam President, and I hope my colleagues will support such an amendment.
Thank you. And the question is on adoption. Will you remark? Right. We are back on the bill. Senator Sampson, will you remark?
Thank you very much, Madam President. I'm rising to lament the failure of my most recent amendment, which I think was a very straightforward illustration of where we are as a state of Connecticut. The tally was 25-11, which is not surprising since that also happens to be the makeup of the legislature, 25 members of the Democrat majority, 11 members of the Republican minority. And that was a very, very simple statement about what we think should happen with the taxpayers' dollars. The state acknowledges that they are in possession of $330 million excess taxes that belong to the people of Connecticut. I believe that money should be returned back to those taxpayers. Clearly, the majority disagrees. And in fact, they're empowering the governor to be able to use that $330 million in any way he so chooses, irregardless of the individual thoughts and approval of this legislative body or any lawmaker or the people they represent. Emergency certified bills, emergency powers should be designed to protect people, not politicians. Frankly, this whole bill feels like a bit of a magic trick. On one hand, there's like a sleight of hand where we're being distracted with this drama that's unfolding on a national level, while the other hand quietly reaches into the taxpayer's wallet. I think it's a disgrace, Madam President, and I'll be voting no on granting this authority to the governor and taking away the money of the people and their best interest in how it should be used. Thank you.